Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. My Horror Story as a Tow Truck Driver by Late Garden. I was an RTTO, that is, registered tow truck operator, for about 2 years. It was a great job. Pay was good, lots of overtime, and I had on-call shifts. I got into the career because of shows I watched as a kid, like Highway Through Hell. So when I got the chance to go into the field, I jumped on it. The first month was good. Gained a lot of experience and some new skills. And part of our job as an RTTO was emergency calls with police and fire for crash scenes. So I saw a lot of tragic stuff. DUI fatalities, hit and runs, non-DUI fatalities, etc. The job can be very emotionally and mentally draining, and can mess you up if you're not careful. However, there's another kind of aspect to the job not a lot of drivers talk about. The paranormal. Odd or off calls, stuff that unsettles you. Almost every tow truck driver has experienced it. This happened on a snowy, cold November night in 2023. We didn't get a lot of calls that day, so I was just chilling at the shop for my on-call shift. Then all of a sudden, I got a Washington State Patrol call for a broken-down WSP car off this dirt road. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't too weird for me since I'd gotten a few calls like it before. So I just hopped in my flatbed and drove up to the call location. The directions took me a good 30 minutes or so outside of the city to the mountains on I-90. By the time I got off the freeway, it was super foggy and very hard to see, so I just took it slow and easy to be safe. I kept driving up the now dirt mountain road, and I kept thinking to myself that this was a really odd road for a state police vehicle to be on, since they usually stay on the interstates and state highways. But I just shrugged it off, since he could have just been out there helping a sheriff or something more normal. I finally got to the location and just stopped the truck and sat there for a minute. I mean, what the hell, I thought to myself. The WSP car was parked out on this mountain road with all its doors open, and no lights on, with no officers in sight. It was so foggy I could really only see the car, but it was clear to me that no one else was around. I very heavily contemplated just turning around and going back, but I eventually decided to hop out and inspect the car and look for the officer. As a tow truck driver, I always carried with me, so I grabbed my AR with my sidearm holstered and got out of the truck, not knowing what the hell I was about to walk into or see. I walked up to the car very cautiously, and at first checked out the driver's seat. Nothing was missing. All the equipment was still in its place and everything. Then I walked around to the passenger side again, and the same thing. Nothing had been missing, nothing looked like it had been moved. Then I went to look at the trunk where they usually keep their ARs and shotguns, etc. I got to the truck, but this time the AR, and only the AR, was missing. That's when I noticed that the forest was dead quiet. No wind, no nothing. I've seen a lot of messed up stuff. Dead bodies, entire families killed in one accident, etc. But I was completely unnerved right then. Something inside me was telling me to get the hell out of there. But before I did anything, I called my dispatcher just to make sure I had the right location and information, and sure enough, everything came back correct. At that point, I was ready to just get the hell out of there as fast as possible. Right before I turned the truck around, I yelled out for the cop, but nothing, just dead silence. Something was not right, I said to myself, and just booked it out of there. The whole drive back, I had this sick feeling like I stumbled across something I was absolutely not supposed to see. I kept thinking why the cop was all the way out there. Why did he leave the car? And why were all the doors wide open? Or if it was even a cop in the first place. I mean, more or less, why one AR was missing when thousands of dollars worth of equipment were in that car untouched. Once I got back to the shop, I called the police dispatcher that gave us the call. Since I knew her, I was hoping she could give me some answers. But no, she said the exact same thing that was said to me on the original call. That a WSP car was broken down and just needed a tow. I never told my supervisor or anyone else out of fear that they wouldn't believe me. I mean, I probably wouldn't have been if they had been in my shoes. I never heard anything about a missing cop or anything on the news. I mean, there was just nothing about this story that I could follow up on. Whatever. That still creeps me out to this day, just thinking about it. The Nightmare That Only Gets Worse by Conquin93. I feel like I need to start this off with a warning that this story does contain explicit content, and I share it hoping that it helps me maybe identify what is affecting me through the help of anyone else that has experienced something similar, so maybe then I can get rid of it. Let me start this story by backtracking a couple of years. I was living in Flagstaff, Arizona. I was 28 years old and living with my sister, and we had an upstairs neighbor that was violent and strange. I was and am convinced she was possessed. I mean, she would spit on me and would absolutely flip out in the middle of the night, sounding like she was about to break through the floor. My sister actually had her arrested about a year before I moved in for trying to throw her down the stairs. I mean, this violence was definitely weird, as both of us were nice, quiet, kind people. Shortly after moving in, I suddenly, for the first time in my life, started having seizures, which caused me to break both my foot and later ankle from those seizures, and required 2 surgeries with a third pending. I only bring that up because it was the start of a series of very strange and unfortunate events. Due to the surgeries and seizures and the fact that I have a history of opioid addiction, they wouldn't even prescribe pain medication after surgery, which I understand, but the first surgery was just too much for my newly found sobriety, and I ended up falling back into an opioid addiction. Fentanyl, to be exact. What I found out later was the seizures that started out of nowhere were getting bad, and at the same time I started noticing a dark presence that was constantly around me. One night, while in Flagstaff, I was about to jump into the shower, and my bathroom door came flying open and hit me in the back while I was standing in front of it. I thought it was my sister, but then I discovered that she was at work at the hospital where she worked as an overnight nurse. I was very active in my addiction, and immediately after I had surgery, I went to a rehab, got out, relapsed again, and my sister basically disowned me due to my relapse. She still refuses to talk to me as I write this, but by the end of 2022 I got help and have stayed clean and sober since. At that point I was a 32-year-old male. I had a girlfriend and I maintained a pretty decent job managing a small team at a car dealership. I've never had hallucinations or suffered psychosis of any real sort, but I feel like I'm going insane at times. But really I know I'm not. This basically is the part where things started to get worse for me. As I said, I was diagnosed with epilepsy after having probably 100 seizures in a 1.5-year period with multiple hospital stays. And in July of 2024, I was in a car accident that landed me in the ICU at the trauma hospital with 2 fractured vertebrae. I was terrified and alone. I found out I wasn't going to need surgery, but still was out of work for over a month and was extremely depressed. About 2 weeks after I got back to work, I was laying in bed one night around the first week of October, and I noticed what looked like a faint shadow pacing around my bed quickly. And it scared me so bad that I didn't sleep in my apartment for a month. And then once while I was in my car, it felt like there was something grabbing at my legs and feet. I started capturing videos of just weird, out-of-place stuff moving, and I noticed that there was a faint sound of a super high-pitched noise like what you hear when a TV is on. and strange voices of a female. I eventually worked up the courage to sleep in my house again, and I started to notice there were more of those shadow entities, and they would cause me to feel pain in my genitalia and anal region, which is kind of embarrassing to admit. I was constantly being touched, and this thing followed me everywhere, even to work. I also started hearing really faint, ominous, dreadful sounds like horns of sorts. I would also notice that sometimes it seemed like there was something that had more power than the other entities and didn't look like a faint shadow. It looked like a mirage in the desert, just in the shape of a human being. I noticed the shadows jump if I throw exorcism water at it, and if I hold my rosary out towards them, my rosary will spin and my crucifix necklace gets pulled tightly. The noises started with the frequent sound of a single whistle here and there. But I also heard that high-pitched noise constantly, and other strange noises that I can only describe as electronic noises. I even hear what I can only equate to what I would assume as a portal sound, like sucking something through, and then something or someone yelling, "Hey!" at me in a strangely normal human voice for about 2 seconds, before hearing the weird noise again, and sounding like it was sucked out through this portal noise. I recently just moved, and things seem almost worse. I'm also working with the church who is putting me in touch with an exorcist. I just don't feel possessed, but this thing definitely has an obsession with my male reproductive organs and anal region, so I'm constantly on guard. As I mentioned, I recently just moved, and the church is so slow. I do online deliverance prayers, but nothing is working. Has anyone out there ever experienced anything like this? It's been an absolute nightmare, and I could seriously use some help. I'll also add that due to my history with addiction, I do see a psychiatric doctor for depression. But she even told me I don't suffer from psychosis, and that I should just contact a priest. So please, anyone out there, if you've experienced anything like this, please let me know. Strange Encounter in the RVG by I Licked It, Now I Own It. On Glasscock, just south past the elementary school in El Tigre in the Rio Grande Valley, this happened. Different years, but both before the big freeze killed so many of the orange trees years back. One of the strange things that we saw was just a normal dude who ran out of the orange trees and across the road into a field. Except he was butt-ass naked and running like a coyote, which is what I assumed it was at first from a distance. The guy ran off into the night, and that was that. But the second thing that I saw is more of an actual puzzle, and I'm glad I can actually talk about it now. This happened in the early evening, and having my kid in the car with me, I didn't want to stop to photograph some weird shit, if you know what I mean. What we saw was a massive dark gray humanoid bird-looking thing. It was just standing in the shadows of the trees. At first I thought it was an escaped zoo shoebill, until we got closer to it. And upon passing it, it had what looked like long, sickly thin arms and a partially human face with excessively large dark eyes. What I thought was a shoebill's long and wide beak was actually a thin-looking chest. I couldn't see too much of the legs or lower half, but it was remarkably tall. I'm 5'7", and I wouldn't be surprised if it was at least a head taller. I'd slowed down from 40 miles an hour to roughly 10 as we passed it, and it appeared to walk forward while stretching its arms towards us, moving its face directly towards us. Not the car. Us. The people inside. My daughter started to cry, and I just hit the gas and took off. Reassuring her all the while that it was just an escaped shoebill. It must have looked gangly because it was lost. And it looked gangly because it was lost. That was it. Nothing special happened. We didn't hear anything, it didn't chase us or anything like that. It just looked freaky as all get the fuck out, man. My mother-in-law believes we witnessed La Lechuza. And I'm not a native from the Rio Grande Valley. I'm originally from Virginia and Kentucky. Thus, I'm unfamiliar with large fauna in the area. I'm quite a skeptical person, so any wildlife info that anyone has out there would be appreciated. And I'm also open-minded to anyone else's thoughts or beliefs on what that could have been that we saw out there in the RVG. I got a knock on the door in the middle of the night at a cabin in the woods by Anonymous. I'm a 34-year-old male, and a few years ago I had an extremely stressful week at work. So I decided to book a cabin on Airbnb at the very last minute for the same night on a Friday. Me and my dog packed up, and I drove up there about an hour and a half away. I stopped on the way and got a bottle of wine in a town about 20 minutes from the cabin, and then I went and got food at a restaurant just down the road. The place had a very small-town vibe. I got to the cabin around 7:45, just enough light out to start a fire, which I did. The cabin was down a gravel road that was about a 5-minute drive from the main road. It was pretty fucking secluded. It had a pretty fucking secluded feeling. Even though in comparison to some actually secluded spots, this was only about 20 minutes from like a gas station. There was no cell service near the cabin. It stopped a minute down the road. I didn't mind that because it was nice to just decompress. The reviews of the place were all great. It had electricity and a clean, updated bathroom. The microwave and fridge were nothing fancy, but clean. It had a nice front porch to sit on, and there were windows on every wall of the building to see out into the woods around it. The driveway coming up from the back side of the cabin stopped completely alongside the right. My dog and I sat around the fire until about 11 or 11:30, and then I put it out and went inside to go to bed with the dog just putzing around on my phone. The dog kept becoming alert to noises outside, but I took that as the woods doing their thing. About 45 minutes into laying in bed, I heard a light knock at the door. To say I was fucking terrified is an understatement. My heart fucking dropped into my gut. I didn't answer it, and I heard a light knock again about 30 seconds later. Now I was wondering if something was wrong with the Airbnb because there was no cell service, and the owner couldn't get to me. Did I not notice the place was on fire? I don't know. In that scenario, it all sort of runs through your head fast. The door was solid and locked, but there was a window to the right of it on the porch. I turned the porch light on and peeked my head in the window, and a guy was standing there. He didn't seem scary necessarily, and he may have been drunk. But he wasn't like smashing down the door or screaming. He immediately saw me. The windows were like mad old and shitty, so I could tell he'd be able to hear me even though the door was closed. I said, "What do you want?" And he motioned his head toward the door to come into the cabin. I said, "Why?" with an attitude, because now, who the fuck is this? He said, "For sex." Now, in my mind, I was like, what? I told him, "This is highly inappropriate, and you need to leave right now. I have a GPS cell phone and will call the police immediately." I didn't have a GPS phone, but I've always been a fast thinker, and I hoped it would scare him off. He quickly turned around and left the porch. The cabin was mostly one open room, so I quickly laid back down in the bed, heart pounding. I didn't know if he was going to go get a gun or something to break in with. Directly across the bed from me was the window that looked out onto the driveway, and I could see the running lights that turn on when your car doesn't have the lights actually on. I could see those as this car or whatever backed up. I laid in bed in fear for about another 3 or 4 minutes, honestly thinking of stuff I had to use as a weapon. This was during COVID time, so I had rubbing alcohol and a lighter right there on my bedside table. My plan was, if this guy got in somehow, I'd light him on fire. I got up after a few minutes and went and pushed a dresser and chair in front of the door. The cabin was elevated, so I wasn't terribly worried about the windows except the one on the porch. Once again I laid back down in bed, lights off, and terrified, and wide awake, till the sun came up. The guy never came back. I packed up and left as soon as it was bright enough and messaged the Airbnb owner as soon as I got cell service. He said that nothing like that had ever happened, and they offered to help me file a police report. I didn't because I live far away, and I think this was just a one-off thing. But questions that I have to this day are, 1. How did he know I was there? All I can think is that he followed me from the small town I'd stopped in about 20 minutes away. I'm a gay man, and I'm not necessarily feminine presenting, but if you have the eye, you can tell. I'm assuming the locals must know there is an Airbnb out there, too. The other thing is, 2. How did he manage to get his truck down the road quietly and with no lights on? Did he push it the last bit of the way? Did I really not notice the running lights? I mean, it was pretty quiet out there except for the woodland noises, and I didn't hear anyone pull up or walk up. The Rural Church, submitted by Mixelplick. My hometown is very small and rural. It's not a very interesting place to grow up, and my friends and I were always trying to come up with interesting diversions to preserve our collective sanity. We all had some degree of interest or curiosity in the paranormal, and living in the South, ghost stories were fairly common. So we decided that if there was any truth to those tales, we wanted to experience them firsthand. We began our own little paranormal investigation group, limited to our group of friends, and set out to investigate every tale we heard. When those were exhausted, we sought out new leads, asking older relatives and acquaintances who were native to the area if they had heard any spook stories. Those too were soon investigated. And we were still bored. My younger sister found a map in our own house, which was very old, that showed the entire county as well as a few neighboring ones, and gave the location of churches, firehouses, and cemeteries. This was a jackpot, and we immediately began systematically visiting every church and every cemetery, marking them off the map as we progressed, searching for any sign of ghostly habitation. We saw the glowing tombstone, a local attraction that the police tried to keep the kids away from. It did indeed glow with an eerie green phosphorescence, but only when struck by moonlight. Many of the stories turned out to be based on natural phenomenon or optical illusions, to our great disappointment. Most of our leads were total washouts, with nothing interesting at all to see or hear. A few created feelings of anxiety in the group or produced impressions of other presences, but overall, most of the summer was spent on fool's errands. Then, I heard about the church. The summer was over and I was back in college when an acquaintance of mine told me about a small adventure he had had at a haunted church. He was a police dispatcher in the local constabulary, a large and powerful man. He said he was with a young lady with whom he desired to score, and he decided to take her to an old church that was supposed to be haunted in order to get her in the mood, as it were. She said she felt anxious even being near the place, and he had no intention of leaving his truck himself. I should mention that in my area, at least, there is a standard story that everyone tells about any church that looks creepy. They say that the pastor, deacon, or whatever was found dead there one morning, his head having been cut off, presumably during the night. The church was then haunted, possibly by the murdered man. Invariably, there is an element about a Bible, most often a large one on a pedestal right inside the door. Supposedly, no one can pick it up. Or perhaps someone can pick it up, but not approach the podium with it as it becomes increasingly heavy, or it bleeds, or it's always on the same page. Whatever. And they always tell you that the church is never locked, and you can go in at any time, though that was never the case. My police friend proceeded to tell me the same story about this particular church, and needless to say I was not particularly impressed, having heard the same story about many other churches, most of which turned out to be totally innocuous. But, in my pursuit of the strange and interesting, I persuaded him to take me there anyway. Another guy I knew decided to come along, and he brought his girlfriend. We all piled into my Grand Am and took off for Lewisburg. Lewisburg is a small town, too. You can pass right through it without noticing it very much. We took a series of back roads to get to the church, and the roads started out bad and continued to get progressively worse until my only thought was, please, don't let my car break down here. The trees on either side of the road were very thick and covered the sky almost completely above the road, creating an eerie and claustrophobic feeling. Suddenly, we went around a curve, and the church was before us. There was a small gravel area on the right side of the road in front of the church. Wrought iron gates opened onto a small path that led up to the church, perhaps 80 feet from the gravel area. The church itself didn't look particularly old, maybe 40 years or so, and it was about the size of a large barn. A graveyard surrounded the church on both sides and continued behind it, like a horseshoe, with the church in the middle. I decided that the little gravel area, room enough for 2 cars parallel to the road, was too conspicuous to park, and I spotted a small pull-off across the road from the church. The area was wooded, and it looked like I could pull the car out of sight. I parked the car and began to get out. The policeman, whose name was David, immediately protested. He thought it was a really bad idea to get out. And I responded that, hey, I've just driven a long way. There's no way I'm not going to investigate. The other guy, Art, and his girl, Crystal, spoke up and said no way were they leaving the car. I said that was fine, as I had the only flashlight, and they could just sit in the car, in the dark. They soon followed me. I went across the road through the wrought iron gates onto the path, and thus to the porch of the church. I twisted the doorknob with no expectation that it would turn. But it did. It really was unlocked. My party began to protest, and surely I didn't intend to enter. Yeah, I did. And once again, after a moment, they followed me. The interior of the church was a major disappointment. There was no pedestal, no Bible. It was fairly standard as far as churches go. My party felt very uneasy, and each of them said at least once that the place felt wrong, somehow bad. Me? I felt nothing. Over a period of years, I've noticed that some people seem to be more in tune with spirits or psychic vibrations or whatever they are, while some seem oblivious to them as a blind man to light. I happen to be blind to these paranormal things. I poked around a little but found nothing interesting, and the place looked to me like it was regularly used for services. So we exited the church. My party expressed great relief when we left and indicated that we could leave at any moment. I felt like I had wasted my evening, not to mention a tank of gas, and I insisted upon looking at the graveyard before we left. Grudgingly, they agreed. The graveyard was very old. A few of the stones were from the past 20 years or so, but mostly were in the early 1900s. Some of the stones were too old and worn to read at all, and basically looked just like a regular granite nubs. A few of the graves were weird, though, with tiny wrought iron fences around the grave in stone, some to a height of about 3 feet. Finally, it seemed that I had exhausted all of the possibilities that the place had to offer, so I agreed to leave when they wanted to. Everyone but me was very glad to go and expressed great unease at even being there. We walked back to the pull-off and got in the car, and when I turned my headlights on, I saw that the pull-off was adjacent to another small graveyard that we didn't notice previously when we were walking in the darkness toward the church. I insisted that we look at it before leaving. This area had much stranger graves than the other larger ones surrounding the church. Some of the graves were nothing more than piles of stones, and one was encircled by a small barbed wire fence. My party was huddled together in fear and begged me to leave. They said that they felt evil presences, and I was prepared to agree once again to leave, when I spotted a small path that led into the forest. I told them we could leave after checking out the path, and they all said no way were they going down that path. I said, fine with me. Wait for me here, and then I set off down the path. The path led to a clearing of 150 feet or so in diameter. I'm a poor judge of distance, but that's about how big it was, and it was in the middle of the woods. The trees made an abrupt wall all around it, and it did seem odd and pretty creepy. I was walking into the clearing with my flashlight pointed straight ahead, scanning the area for anything interesting, and I could hear that David, Art, and Crystal were now following me, perhaps 75 feet behind. Suddenly, both my eyes and my flashlight found a huge beast before me. It was the size of a very large man on all fours. Its body was covered with silver or grayish hair, and it seemed to be gnawing at something or smelling something on the ground. The instant my light hit it, it raised its head and looked directly at me. I remember the impression of a snout and pointed ears towards the top of the head, and its eyes, however, were human. By that I mean that they didn't reflect the beam of my flashlight like a dog or cat would, or any night animal for that matter. I can't stress enough, they looked like the eyes of a man. The beast was about 20 feet in front of me, and there was a gravestone in front of it and slightly to the left. Another was behind and to the right of it. It looked at me for maybe a second or two. I was completely frozen. No thought entered my mind, no emotions. I was blank. Then the creature stood up. It looked about 8 or 9 feet tall. Just very, very big. Not fat, but more lithe and muscular. It turned toward the forest before us and ran into the trees. It moved so fast I have no words to adequately describe it. It was very nimble, especially for a creature so big. My mind began to thaw out. I had seen, or at least thought I saw, the beast for around 3 seconds. It's kind of hard to say, as the entire encounter was in that molasses-slow perception usually reserved for automobile accidents, and it seemed like several minutes. My first reaction was that I had imagined it, or hallucinated it, or otherwise just conjured it up. I realized that I had heard and could still hear the beast making its way through the forest. I could hear the leaves crackling and twigs snapping as something large made its way rapidly away from my position. David came running up beside me. I wondered if he had seen it for an instant, and then I heard what he was yelling at me as he ran up. "Did you see that fucking thing? Did you see it? Jesus, it was huge!" I asked him to describe what he saw, and he described the creature perfectly, the way that I saw it. I looked out into the forest, shining my light around pointlessly. For some reason, my instinct was to pursue the creature, but David physically dragged me back to the path, not bothering to try to dissuade me verbally. Art and Crystal were back at the edge of the path, and Crystal was sobbing uncontrollably, and Art was also on the verge of tears, panic evident in his voice. They both denied they had seen anything. We got into my car, and as I started it up, I felt fear for the first time in the evening. We tore off and aimed for home. David asked Art and Crystal how they could have missed seeing that beast, and Art burst into tears and screamed, "How the hell could I not see it?" David proceeded to grill them for details, their terrified descriptions matching David's and my own memory perfectly. Later, at my apartment, I related the story to my roommate. He thoughtfully puffed on his cigarette for a moment and then asked me, "What would you have done if the creature had run towards you?" My blood felt like ice. For some reason, it had never even occurred to me how easily that thing could have ripped me to shreds, and its speed was such that its prey would have had little time for action before meeting its demise. A few days later, I saw a friend of mine on campus, and we had lunch, and I told him the story. I didn't tell him where I was or the name of the church, and he said he knew of a place that sounded similar, which he had heard was haunted. He said it was in Lewisburg, and then proceeded to name the church. I was astounded. He said that the people in the area knew all about the church and the graveyard. He said the graveyard was very, very old and that some Native Americans were buried there. The graveyard was there before the church and even the road. Both were built on top of it. My mind raced, and I immediately realized that the small graveyard was pretty obviously a part of the larger horseshoe-shaped one. I asked him if they had moved the graves or just the stones, and he said that he didn't know, but there was no record of their having been moved. He told me that he'd been there several times himself, and that in his opinion it was definitely haunted. Another friend of mine was more interested in the creature itself, and said that he had seen something similar, and that they were known to live in an area that he described, which included the area in which the church was located. He described old logging roads that cut into large sections of virgin forest nearby. He said that teenagers used to park on the logging roads to make out, and that one of his friends actually had a terrifying experience there. The guy was with his girlfriend in a pickup truck having sex, when the truck suddenly began to bounce up and down, so hard that the back end was striking the ground. They stopped what they were doing and looked around in alarm. In the truck bed was a large brown beast that sounded much like the creature I had seen. It was jumping up and down in the bed, its arms dangling like a gorilla. And the two people began screaming in terror, incapable of action. But the beast seemed to grow bored of the game in a minute or two, and then leapt out of the truck bed, darted across the road, and went into the forest at an amazing speed. The pair obviously left the area post-haste. I've personally visited that church on 7 or so occasions, and I've never failed to experience supernatural occurrences of some kind. I'd like to hear from anyone who has seen or heard of any similar creatures. This story has become overlong, and I'll end it. I've deliberately omitted the name or exact location of this church, as the police are already upset that I and my friends visit it. We've spoken with them several times, and they realize we mean no harm and are not damaging the property in any way. The land is public property, and they have acknowledged that they have no actual right to prevent us from going there. But I wonder if the police are aware of what goes on there. To tell you the truth, I suspect they do. Creepy Crawlspace by Anonymous. My story took place 7 years ago. I was 15 at the time, and our family moved around a lot. We settled into this house in Pennsylvania. I don't remember the age of the house or much of its history, but as soon as I spent the first night in that house, I knew something wasn't right. You would get these really unexpected bouts of uneasiness or anxiousness there. There would be freezing cold spots in the house in the summer, and strange noises unassociated with settling sounds. In that house, there was a crawl space that connected 3 of the 4 bedrooms. I say crawl space, but really me, my sister, and brother would use it for our hangout spot. We spent a lot of time there, but rarely one of us would ever venture into the crawl space on our own. We occupied the 3 bedrooms that were connected by the crawl space, while my parents' room was the one on the other side of the hallway. Sometimes at night, we would use the crawl space to creep into each other's rooms and talk way into the night. One evening, I remember trying to sneak into my sister's room through the crawl space. It was very dark there. There was a light in there, but it had a pull chain instead of a wall switch, and the light was hard to locate in the dark. So I thought I would feel my way to my sister's door. While feeling around in the dark, I heard a grunt, and I stepped dead in my tracks. Clearly, somebody was in the crawl space with me. There was no question as to what I heard. I thought it was my brother, so I stayed real quiet and thought I'd play around and scare him. Finally, after a lot of silence, I yelled real loud, "Boo!" thinking that he'd cry out or scream or something. Nothing. It was right then that I almost pissed myself, no joke. If I could have, I would have. Something just felt so wrong. Butterflies in my gut, I raced back towards my open door and slammed it shut. Needless to say, I didn't go back into that crawlspace again. I told my siblings about the incident, and my brother didn't believe me, and my sister kept insisting that it was my brother all along, even though he kept denying it. A couple of months passed, and nothing unusual happened. Then one night, something did. I'd been sick and had been in bed for most of the day, and I wasn't allowed out of my room for fear that I'd give my virus to the family. My brother was sleeping over at a friend's house, and my sister was asleep in her room, and my parents were downstairs watching TV. I'd been sleeping myself, but something woke me right up. You know that feeling when you're dozing or about to fall asleep, and for some reason you feel like you're falling and you jerk up in bed? Well, that's what I felt, but I was coming out of a normal sleep. I had the butterflies again, but it didn't seem anything was wrong. Just then, I heard creak. Yep, you frickin' guessed it. My crawlspace door was opening. By now I could see better in the darkened room. I looked toward the door, half expecting my sister to come out. Nope. Nothing. For some reason, I'll never be able to explain it to this day, that feeling of complete fear and danger flooded into me. I was so scared to begin with, but this feeling was like I could sense something dangerous coming. Like I knew what was in that gaping hole of blackness was observing me. I'm crying as I type this. I remember how I felt, and I know that I never want to feel that way again. I don't know what gave me the courage or the strength, but I jumped up. I hurled myself across that room to my bedroom door. I don't even remember running down the hall. All I remember is me on top of my sister in her bed, clutching onto her with fists, and my sister screaming out of confusion, and me screaming at the top of my lungs, "Don't let it get me! Don't let it get me!" My father, on a more comical note, said he must have grown wings that day. He ran so fast up those stairs he thought someone was murdering us. And I told him what happened. I was hysterical. My parents allowed me and my sister to sleep in their room that night, and in the morning, even though he didn't believe my story, my father screwed all the crawlspace doors shut. There were never any problems after that, apart from the cold spots and such. A couple of years ago, I saw a psychic. My family had moved out since, but I was always curious as to what happened that night. The psychic, not knowing the story, told me that a little boy had died in the house that I had lived in. And that was true. An infant boy was crushed by a roll of carpeting. She said, though, that's not what was in the crawlspace that night. What was in there was something else, something very evil. She also told me that if I stayed any longer in my bed, it would have revealed itself to me. And that's all I cared to know. And, to be honest, I don't really like talking about this with people, since all I've got from that house are such depressing memories. Edge Hill, submitted by Nick I. A few years ago, a friend of mine invited me along for an evening at Edge Hill, the historic battleground in England. The whole thing was instigated by a friend of his who we worked with. That chap had an extensive knowledge of Edge Hill and even knew the real date on which the battle's anniversary fell. Apparently, the dates changed over the years due to changes to the calendar. But the evening was set. Myself and my friend with his friend, and about 4 other blokes were going. We drove up to Edge Hill and parked in a nearby pub car park. And then we walked a short distance along a very dark lane to the start of the hill and entered the first field. We walked down it, making a fair amount of noise, just joking and generally trying to spook each other. At any rate, very little happened as we walked through the field and we entered the next field, feeling a little disappointed. We continued to walk towards the hedge at the end of that field when one of the group spotted some lights in the next field over. We all stopped and looked at those lights. At first appearance, they seemed to be the aircraft warning lights placed on electrical pylons. There were 2 pairs of these lights at the same height from the ground, and from where we stood they appeared to be about 6 feet above the level of the field, and we assumed that they were indeed electrical pylons several miles distant. We continued to look at them, when suddenly the pair on the right moved. This was a dark field, but as we watched the lights moving, it was possible to make out a faint silhouette against the backdrop of distant town lights. The silhouette of a man. As we watched, it became apparent that what we were seeing was a man with a torch strapped to either side of his head, and who appeared to be swaying from one side to the other. One of our lads with us had a large maglite and shone it at the man, but the torch failed to illuminate the area, almost as if the light was being absorbed. Then, the second pair of lights began to move in the same manner. By this time, we had all shut up and we were watching the scene before us. One of us suggested that the show was nothing more than a couple of locals out playing a prank on anyone who would come to do just what we were doing. Spurred on by that, we decided that as there were 7 of us and apparently only 2 of them, the sensible thing to do would be to shout abuse and see what happened. That's what we did, but the lights just carried on dancing and even appeared to get closer. We could see no way through the hedge into that field, and decided the lights were now quite unnerving, and our attempts at communication had failed, so the next best action would be a tactical retreat. We all began walking back up the muddy, slippery field, trying to get to the top of the hill for a better look. About halfway up, I turned around to look at the lights. They were now in our field on the other side of the hedge. That really scared the crap out of me, and I tried to run the rest of the distance, passing a couple of the other people and shouting at them to look behind them. We all ran up the hill and into the next field, eventually reaching the top of it and resting on a bench there. We all sat there, smoking and debating what we had just seen. One of us then noticed something moving in our current field. We watched it, and then saw another thing moving, and then another. Then one of these things came towards us. It was a bloody horse, pure black, no rider. The field seemed to have at least 10 of these horses, all of them black. But we hadn't noticed them on the way down to the field, nor on the way back up. Well, that did it for us. We left the field and walked back down the lane towards the pub car park, feeling a little safer as we saw the lights of the pub ahead. We talked about the horses and the lights and what it could all mean. And one of the lads in the group said that the horses had been seen before around Edge Hill in strange circumstances. Apparently, many horses were killed in the battle, as well as the men. As if to punctuate his dialogue, we suddenly heard this whinny from behind us, and I mean right behind us. We all turned around with a jump, but there was no horse there, and on either side of the lane the hedge was quite low, and there were no horses to be seen. We jogged the remaining distance to our cars and left the area, myself convinced that I had experienced something supernatural that evening. The Moving Doll by Nina. My dad was a truck driver and was always on the road. He used to bring back dolls for my little sister from the places he went while working. I had a fear of dolls since a young age, and I remember when I was 4, I had my mom throw away every doll and stuffed animal in the house. So you can imagine I wasn't too thrilled about him bringing back all those dolls every week. One day, I was homesick from school, and my dad had gotten into town that day. He had given my little sister one of those dolls that when you lay them down, their eyes close, and when they're seated, they open back up. They had all left for Walmart, and Rachel had left the doll lying on the couch. I was terrified of the doll, and I wanted it out of the house. Well, I got the doll and walked outside and down this little alley that was behind our duplex to the dumpster. The duplex dumpster had a lid and a large metal bar that went over it that was locked with a padlock, so that only tenants could use it. Well, I unlocked it and put the doll in, closed it with the metal bar, relocked it, and went back in the house. I needed to do my homework that had been picked up for me, so I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my work. To explain, our dining room. There was a kitchen table up against the wall, and there was a window on the left side of the table in the front. When you looked out the window to your left, you saw another duplex and our back door and steps. I was working away when I happened to look up and saw something red in the corner of my eye. I looked out the window to the left of me, and sitting on the steps was the doll that I had put in the dumpster only an hour before. It was just sitting there in an upright position, facing the window, looking in at me. I was confused because I knew no one had seen me put the doll in the dumpster. Because I was embarrassed of my fear, so I had distinctly made sure no one saw me. I ran outside to the side of the house, grabbed the doll, and went back and put it in the dumpster again, this time keeping an eye out if anyone was watching me. There was no one around. I went back into the house, and by now I was pretty freaked out, but I blew it off, thinking that someone must have seen me and was playing a sick joke. So I went back to doing my homework. Because of the bad feeling I was having, I kept looking out the window like every 5 minutes or so, just to make sure the doll wouldn't return. After about 20 minutes, I realized the doll wasn't coming back, so I put all my attention back into my homework, finishing it about 35 minutes later. I closed my books and put them into my book bag. I was about to get up and get a snack when I looked over, and the doll was sitting there again. But this time it was sitting on the ground up against the house, with its arms around the drain pipe that was there. I was terrified. I grabbed a black garbage bag and ran outside and tossed the doll in the bag, tied it, and ran 4 blocks down the road to the 7-Eleven. And I put the doll into the dumpster there and then ran back home. I was crying my eyes out on the couch when my parents and sister got back. I told them what had happened. They didn't believe me, and I got into a lot of trouble for trashing the doll. But the doll never came back. Rural Indian Story, early 2000s, by Careless Action. Back when I was a kid, our village was not as developed in terms of infrastructure. One thing you should know about people from the rural South is that they're extremely religious and have ceremonies for all sorts of things. This is important for the context of this story. On one of those festival weeks, we decided to visit old temples for prayers. The road wound round a hill and went pretty deep into the forest, and this, coupled it with being monsoon season, meant we took an easy 3 hours to get there. One thing about the monsoon in India is that, bizarrely, some villages get more than others, even if they're a few kilometers apart. So we went from a lightly cloudy village to something straight out of Twilight. We could barely see the road ahead of us. The driver somehow took a wrong turn. I still don't know how. It was mostly hilly roads that were one way, but we ended up even deeper into the forest. Keep in mind it was so dark we thought it was evening despite it being early afternoon. We found a few houses there, and the driver decided to ask around for directions. No dice, all of them were abandoned, but weirdly, they seemed well kept. Okay, we thought, maybe the residents had gone to some festival ceremony. But this deep into the forest? And plus, this was before Google Maps, so our GPS didn't have a stable network. The driver decided to try his luck through the settlement. My parents were getting increasingly worried, as timing is important in rituals. I was at the back, starving, and pre-ritual breakfasts are ass. The road got increasingly shabby, but the driver pushed through. I noticed the trees were slowly looking more decayed, like they were dark brown and the leaves were drooping low. I also noticed a distinct lack of birds, and I was from the city, so country birds were special to me. And then we just heard a noise, like a whistling, singing combination. Again, keep in mind, this was a hilly forest, so maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was the forest itself. It's been many years, but I still remember that sound. My parents were scared at that point. They were scared that there was a large animal stalking us. And unlike Americans, we couldn't carry firearms. My dad urged the driver to turn back, but the guy said he knew the road from here, which is a blatant lie, and that he could drive us out. Besides, going back meant losing fuel. The sound got softer and louder, and at times seemed like it was coming from the car itself. And then we saw some weird shit. I don't remember it exactly since I was a kid, but it seemed like things were dangling from the trees overhead. Dilapidated things. It was so dark I was told it was monkeys, but we had absolutely no idea what it really was at that point. And I remember my head starting to hurt really bad. The driver eventually found his way out, but looked worried. We ditched the temple idea and drove home, and stopped by a cafe for chai, and asked around in our native language. I found out years later that we had driven through a black magic area of the forest, a place where practitioners congregated to perform old rituals, things our culture now finds dangerous. Apparently, we were the first ones to go through that area in a long while. Most of the locals stayed away. Look, a lot of it was rumors, but we couldn't understand how there was an entire road through it. The locals said the usual, well, the forest is alive, give it respect. But how could the forest magically conjure a road through it? Plus, if there was a road, wouldn't the government have gone through the area and fixed it up? All I was told was the sound was spirits trying to entice us to leave the road or stop the vehicle. Our family living out that way moved, so we haven't gone back to that village. But I remember it being a famous legend in the area, which my parents didn't know as they were from the city. I think they finally expanded the roads there years later. Also, if anyone wants to nitpick the story, in India we consider such villages to be hometowns more than cities, since our ancestors and older relatives had built strong communities there. Real Nightmares by John M. For my whole life, the image of a severed hand has always been a recurring thing in my occasional nightmares. When I have had a nightmare, I've made a habit of just telling myself to wake up, and when fully awake, just checking to make sure everything was fine before going back to sleep, such as turning on the light, looking under the bed, etc. Stuff to put myself back at ease. I'm the eldest of 5 children, and on the day after I graduated from high school in 1980, my mother remarried and she, my brother, and 3 sisters moved to Lewisville, Texas to live with her new husband. One of my sisters, I'll call her Melissa, was very excited to be getting her own room after having shared a room with the other 2 girls her entire life. Not long afterward, I was talking to my mom on the phone and she said something funny was happening. Many mornings she found Melissa sleeping in bed with one of my other 2 sisters in their rooms. When asked about it, Melissa would just say that she'd had a bad dream. But as time went on, it got to the point where Melissa refused to sleep in her own room. The following Christmas break from college, I went to stay with them. And Mom said I could sleep in Melissa's room since she never slept there anyway. It was a very small room, just big enough for a twin bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk. On Christmas Eve, I stayed up very late wrapping some gifts and was the last one into bed. About 2 a.m., I finally turned in and fell asleep, and I began to have a terrible nightmare. In it, there was a severed hand, as I mentioned before, but this time it was for some reason very clear, very cold, and very dead, but felt very malevolent, And oh, by the way, it was trying to strangle me. In the dream, I put my pillow over it to try and hold it down, and it was struggling to get out. I was telling myself to just wake up, that I was just having a bad dream, and finally I did wake up. I sat up in bed, really surprised at how vivid the dream had been, but then I calmed down. I laid back down to go to sleep, and as I always did, to prove to myself there was nothing there, I stuck my hand under the pillow and grabbed a cold, dead hand that squeezed my hand back very hard. I screamed, the kind of scream that you can only make when you're gripped by utter terror, because if you tried to do it consciously, you'd hurt yourself. In seconds, the entire family was at the door to the bedroom. When the light snapped on, I was recoiling back from the pillow in total panic, and told them all that there was a hand under the pillow. I yanked the pillow away, to find nothing, of course. I quickly regained my composure and told everyone to go back to bed, and after about 10 minutes I fell asleep again and slept uneventfully for the rest of the night. The next afternoon, after all the holiday festivities had died down, Melissa asked to speak to me outside, just the two of us. She looked at me square in the eye and said, "There was a hand under your pillow last night. There is something in that room that knows what you're afraid of, and it shows it to you." She then told me that she began having bad nightmares shortly after moving into that room. Melissa had always been afraid of something being under the bed, and several nights she said she'd heard something scrambling around underneath it, and she would get up and turn on the light, but of course there was nothing there. Then one night, when she heard the scrambling, she said out loud, "I am tired of this. I'm not going to get up and look under the bed this time." And suddenly, without warning, something yanked all the covers off her bed from the foot of it. Melissa stood up on the bed and jumped from it to the doorway and ran to the other girl's room. She never slept in that room again. She said it was okay during the daytime and would dress there and do her homework or whatever, but every night she would just lay in bed until everyone else was in bed, and then she would go to her sister's rooms to sleep. She would try to wake up before everyone else in the mornings and then go back to her room, but she didn't always succeed doing that, and that's when my mother found her in there. We never did exactly know what was in that room, a poltergeist or ghost, but whatever it was, it certainly enjoyed scaring you out of your wits. Red Eyes by Lee. While living in Arizona, I'd heard about a place haunted by a pair of glowing eyes outside of Casa Grande, just south of Phoenix. This was one of those houses in which no one will spend more than one night. Yeah, I know, those stories are a dime a dozen and can never seem to be verified, which is why I didn't worry much about it at the time. Several years later, after I'd received some psychic training, a friend and I were in the area and were able to find that particular property. We arrived early in the afternoon to find a long abandoned 2-bedroom, 1-bath mobile home set on about an acre of land, but with no other habitation within a 1-mile radius. There was, of course, no electrical service or water from the well, which was electric. The trailer had been severely vandalized inside and out, with the door torn off and most of the windows smashed. When I first heard of the trailer, I was told it was in good condition. Even in daylight, there was a feeling of something there, an indescribable "someone who hates me is looking at me" feeling. We got our equipment ready and settled down to wait. Well, after nightfall, nothing had happened, and we had pretty much decided that it was all a hoax. Haha, great joke, let's go to bed. With no reason for both of us staying up, Chris took the first watch, and about 10 p.m., she nudged me awake to let me know it had arrived. From the back and master bedroom, the feeling of being watched was very strong, and a pair of red eyes were visible out the window, even through the empty frame. They seemed to be about 200 yards distant. Within an hour, those eyes were still there, and we could see them through every window, and that feeling of being watched was strong throughout the house. When the eyes appeared, they would remain for a minute or two and then just vanish, only to reappear elsewhere. They seemed to be working closer most of the time, but not with every reappearance. By midnight, it had come indoors and was accompanied by a feeling of intense evil and an induced fear on our part. At times we were within 3 feet of it, but we wouldn't approach it when it materialized within 10 feet because of the fear reaction. The best we could do at such times was not turn around and run. The eyes appeared about 6.5 feet above the ground and were about 3 inches across, with irises about 1 inch in diameter, with cat-like pupils that reacted to the light in the correct manner. As we moved, the eyes moved to follow us. If one of us kept the eyes' attention and the other moved behind them, they weren't visible to the other person from behind, but only in about a 180-degree arc centered on the point on which they seemed to be focused, as if they were in a person's head, but only the eyes were visible. Whenever it manifested in a room, the temperature dropped quickly, felt to be about freezing from an ambient temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet our thermometers noted no physical temperature changes at all. This temperature drop was readily noticeable even if the eyes were not seen, as when one of us was looking the other way or had our eyes closed as a control measure. At close range, within 5 feet, there was a faint but definite odor of some unidentifiable decay. It was not the smell of composting vegetable matter, nor of a dead animal or even a human. Dead people do smell different from, say, a dead dog. The emotional responses, both fear and evil in us, increased as the distance to the manifestation decreased. We experimented by moving around the area, and the manifestation usually materialized within 100 feet of us, although at varying ranges. It would not cross the dirt road in front of the house, which is the east border, nor come more than about 100 yards south of the house. We found no such border to the north and west, but were not willing to go more than about 100 yards into the desert on either side. Once on the other side of the road and clear of the affected area, we decided to remain there until morning, and then go back and retrieve our equipment then. Due to the open terrain and the fear that it induced in us, I did not shoot at this thing with my pistol, nor did I attempt to strike it with either sword or staff. Chris did throw a few rocks at the eyes from the other side of the road, but that didn't appear to affect it at all. Photographs we took of this manifestation revealed only fogged film on both visible light cameras, 200 and 1000 speed films, and IR showed only a blurred blob on non-flash shots, and nothing on IR flash shots. No source or other cause was found during a daylight search of the area, and no possible source or cause was found during a check of local records. The few neighbors had only reported that area was supposed to be haunted, and that it had been haunted, quote, since forever, but they knew nothing about the possible source or cause of the haunting. Other than that it existed, felt evil and malevolent, and scared the crap out of us, I still have no idea what it was. The memory of those eyes still comes back to haunt me sometimes. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. And we're at that time of year again. If you have a true scary Halloween story, please send it my way. It's starting early this year. Already I have a couple of stories that have been submitted, so thank you to those of you who have. But I would love to have your stories looking for a great Halloween extravaganza this year. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you saw or heard, give the video a thumbs up. Maybe leave a comment, let me know what you thought of the stories, and if you're not a subscriber, why not be a subscriber too while you're at it? If you'd like to support what I'm doing a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, or consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. There's a link to my TeePublic storefront in the description as well. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.